Hi, everyone. I'm Rick Hanson for the Global Compassion Coalition, here with two friends, Rachel Ebanks Gold, my co-host, and my friend, my benefactor, someone I've learned from, someone I've known quite a long time, the wonderful Margaret Cullen. And we're going to be here talking about what Margaret has created, which is called Compassion Core, this brilliant, important, wonderful way to enable certified teachers of evidence based compassion programs to offer these programs to underserved communities around the world with many, many inspiring stories. So I know we have many people joining us, including people who've received some of these Compassion Core grants. If you like, you're very welcome, whether you've received a grant or not, just anyone, to type in your questions or comments in the chat feature here in StreamYard. We're using StreamYard as a platform so that we can beam out to YouTube and through other channels. I was just thinking, Margaret, before we began, that these signals, because they're electromagnetic, they're actually leaving planet Earth at the speed of light and radiating outward in the shape of a sphere of compassionate wisdom that, who knows, people on Proxima Centauri 3.8 years from now, light years away, will be able to actually tune in to if they exist anyway. So with that as a start, if that's okay, I'd like to read your bio, Margaret, and then we can dive in. All right, great. So what a distinguished biography. Here we go. Margaret Cullen is a licensed psychotherapist and a pioneer in bringing contemplative practices into mainstream settings. She was one of the first 10 people to be certified as an MBSR instructor and has taught around the world. She has led research studies on the impact of contemplative programs for a wide variety of populations across the US and co-developed the compassion cultivation training with Tubten Jinpa, one of the Dalai Lama's primary translator into English, as well as many other distinctions in terms of Tubten Jinpa, at the Stanford University School of Medicine. And she also co-developed the mindfulness-based attention training for military spouses with Professor Amishi Jha at the University of Miami. Margaret is the founder of Compassion Core, a program which brings compassion programs to underserved populations around the world. She also developed mindfulness-based emotional balance and co-authored a book about it with Gonzalo Brito Pons, Dr. Brito Pons. She is a senior teacher and curriculum developer for Humanize, which is a contemplative-based dyad program founded by the German neuroscientist Tanya Singer. Tanya is also on the board of the Global Compassion Core. Margaret is a Mind and Life Fellow on the advisory board of the Global Compassion Coalition. We're very fortunate there, and has been a meditation practitioner for over 40 years. Wow. You've been there from the start. You've been there in the beginning, the middle, and we're still ongoing. So thank you, Margaret, very much for everything you've done, really. Remarkable career, so large-hearted. There's a reason you've been involved centrally in the kitchen, cooking up a lot of great compassion dishes, for many, many people. So thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me, Rick, and for that very full introduction. And as I listen to you, I think I've told many people it all felt so strangely accidental to me, how that all came to be, good fortune, and how my meditation practice just kept leading me to these extraordinary people that I got to work with and learn from.
I know we're going to be exploring a lot of wonderful things, including many practical details about the Compassion Core and ways people can learn about it, ways they can apply for grants if they're a certified teacher of one of these three key programs. We'll get into those details. And also we'll get into details of how people can support this wonderful initiative in which all the money that's donated for it goes right to the teachers so they can serve these underserved populations. And we'll be getting into that. I'd like to start, if it's okay, and I know Rachel will dive into at some point. For you individually, Margaret, for many people, meditation contemplative practice in a secular format or in a religious format. Contemplative practice tends to be an inward, self-involved practice. I don't mean that it's narcissistic. I just mean that it's internally focused. And a longstanding question, classic question throughout the ages, has been how to connect that internal practice with outer action. And compassion very much is the bridge between the two. And I wondered if you could speak to that, how the two have played out for you, these two strands of internal contemplative practice and outward facing compassionate action.
Wow. Let me think about that for a minute. That's such an important question. And, in all the years that I was involved in mindfulness-based training, that became one of the central questions around what we're doing. And I think everyone who got involved in mindfulness personally and then professionally really cared about social impact and held that question close to their heart, including me. Again, I feel almost embarrassed to say that I followed the pretense of accident, because as I held these questions close to my heart, the opportunity just arrived to work with Jimpa on this much more kind of, completely compassion-focused training. And in the early days, I was holding the question deeply in my heart. What's the difference between this 8-week mindfulness-focused program of MBSR, MBEB, and this 8-week compassion-focused program? And how are the outcomes different? How are they the same? Not as a scientist, as a teacher who was looking anecdotally at outcomes. And at the same time, my practice shifted naturally because I was training teachers and developing teacher trainings and kind of marinating in compassion. And that became my central practice after 20 or more years of mindfulness. So I was looking at myself too, and it felt to me like a kind of natural development personally and professionally. And I did see that there are differences, there are overlaps, but there are also differences. And the differences are what I think you were maybe getting at. Although I don't, as you said, I don't see mindfulness as a narcissistic or self-centered enterprise by any means. And I do think that by cultivating mindfulness, we become much more effective citizens in the world, more effective friends, mothers, partners, professionals, philanthropists, service people. However, the focus on compassion had a different outcome. What people were reporting was a more kind of concrete and direct compassion-based action in the world.
Yeah. I mean, you're speaking to a comment that some have made that mindfulness training is enough, although you well know that mindfulness itself is morally neutral. It's simply sustained present moment awareness. And right, a burglar could be mindful, no?
I don't agree.
Yeah, say more.
I know, I've been involved in this debate for many years, and I think it's certainly, I respect the school that believes that mindfulness is morally neutral. However, there are a lot of people who disagree with that, and you can find evidence for it in the suit coexist with unwholesome states in the mind. So what we might say, the sniper, I have an article about this in Inquiring Mind, where, Alan Wallace, as a Tibetan Buddhist, does believe that it's morally neutral and that a sniper can be mindful. but the other people, uh, it was, who was on that? It was Joseph Goldstein, Jan Chosen Bays, and maybe John Kabat-Zinn disagreed and
Hmm.
felt that it could, no unwholesome states can coexist with mindfulness. So
Hmm.
I would say that's up for debate.
Very interesting. Well, as you know, the Global Compassion Coalition, of course, welcomes a wide range of views as long as there's a central commitment to relieving suffering. And I want to get at this whole idea of cultivation altogether, which, of course, is very much in my own personal professional background. How, you know, the positive neuroplasticity of how do you turn states into traits? How do you turn experiences of compassion into trait compassion, for example? And I was just kind of wondering if we are naturally compassionate. And Paul Gilbert would say, yeah, humans evolved to be naturally compassionate, certainly toward us. Maybe not so much toward them by nature, but anyway, why do we need to cultivate it? And so could you speak to that? And then we can get into the details of these compassion cultivation programs that the Compassion Corps supports. So just in general, if we're already so naturally loving, why do we have to work at becoming, loving?
I am so glad you asked that. This morning, to refresh my memory, I printed out a list of the grantees and
Yeah.
I reviewed the programs that grantees offered. And it really hit me, as it has often in the past, that these people who come to these programs are already really compassionate
Mm.
and they don't need to be more compassionate. What they need is to understand how to build sustainable compassion. They
Ah.
need to understand that compassion fatigue is a myth and that compassion collapse can be avoided. And they need to understand, kind of really refine what it is and what it isn't, and access the dimension of compassion that has a self sustaining superpower
Mm.
embedded in it, so
Mm.
that they have direct access to that
Mm.
and they don't get pulled into the counterfeits, the near enemies, the kind of mire of other competing emotions and misunderstandings about compassion. So, in a
Mm.
sense, I agree completely there. And especially, not only do we all have compassion, unlimited potential for it, but I would say, especially people who take compassion training programs who self select are already so compassionate. And in a sense, they need to be disabused of any idea that they need to be more compassionate, but they need more wise compassion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Margaret, I was just curious, in terms of your own personal experience, what has helped you to develop a sense of compassion within yourself? And also, was there any sort of defining moment where it really kind of stuck out for you, the extreme power in self-compassion, sort of as a different modality or slightly different modality to the mindfulness that you were trained in initially?
Hmm. It's interesting that I feel emotional thinking about that question, trying to really engage with it right now. You know, I've struggled my whole life with all sorts of self-doubt and imposter syndrome, and especially in my career working with lots of really brilliant, accomplished people. What am I doing here? What am I doing teaching compassion? And who am I to teach that? And my family often reminds me I'm not qualified, especially my daughter. So I, I, what I've found most powerfully has been to that compassion offers unconditional redemption. You know, there is something so beautiful and important to me about that idea. To me personally, I felt so in need of redemption in my life in so many ways. And there is an unconditional redemption through compassion that we can offer to ourselves and to others, that I think may be one of the things that touches me the most personally. Um, Beyond that, I love, like right now, I love talking to people about compassion. I love that we can get honest and go deep and be real, and that we can call each other to connect with our higher angels, and how readily they come forward when we do that in conversation, wherever it happens. I feel my experience has been that those higher angels of compassion are longing for conversation. They're longing for expression. They're longing to see examples in the world, um, that inspire and draw it out. That I think we all crave it, and I certainly do too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is there, again, I hope it's okay. I'll ask you a personal question. And if you want to turn it back on me, feel free. And also, as people make comments in the chat, feel free to ask questions. It's quite remarkable, all the people who've hopped on board this. So, is there something that's kind of at the edge for you, Margaret, that other people might relate to with regard to limits on compassion? Sorry, I have compassion for my poor throat. I know there's research that shows that it's a lot easier to have compassion for people we like or we morally approve of, but people who have wronged us or we feel are to blame themselves for their suffering or are them to our us tends to be harder to have compassion for. So I myself work on those edges, and those edges include family members that have wronged me and also political figures that I feel are creating great harm. And I just kind of wonder if for you, where the edges are of your practice that other people can relate to. That maybe we all have struggles with what those edges are and how we can authentically expand that circle of our compassion. I wonder how that has showed up for you over the years.
Okay, well, I was going to ask you, but you built your answer in very cleverly, Rick. So you got yourself off the hook there. Good job.
You're a therapist. You can keep going
job.
if you want.
Well done. So, yeah, you know what's funny? I mean, funny, I don't know, maybe surprising a little bit, is that we've had, I think, for those of us living in the United States in the last decade, have politically, many of the people on this call been really challenged around compassion for political leadership. And I know this has been true around the world too. We're not special, but um, that's not hard for me. It's really odd. It's not hard for me to feel compassion for Trump, for example, someone I disdain personally. That's not hard. What's hard for me is is where my struggles are, my edge are with getting to know people who are leaders in the field and seeing their shadow side, and a kind of perhaps a naive and idealistic, maybe immature, that's kind of pejorative, but I've held on to a wish that they would somehow not have feet of clay and, live impeccably in terms of compassion. So I think that's been the edge for me.
Why?
And yeah,
Well, why do you think that particular one? Because that is so interesting, and I think
yeah,
it gets in the ways that it's almost easier to have compassion sometimes for strangers than for those
yes.
who are close to us. Maybe it's part of that.
Yeah, I think it's expectation. It's that classic gap between expectation and reality that has to be bridged. But I think, perhaps I think the naive part of it is that any time that we struggle with others, personally, I think it has to do with how we feel about ourselves. And I think it's more a measure, yeah, we're both therapists, right?
That's
It's
good.
more a measure of my ability to accept my own shadow, and to the extent that I can do that as a compassion teacher, I probably can do a lot better with people who I think are, more uh, greater compassion, um, what's the word, teachers in the world than I am. So it's probably, that's what it boils down to. I don't know.
I know Rachel wants to hop in. I just want to note that you're getting at self-compassion, of course, in addition to, like
Yes.
as part of the compassionate
Yes.
field. And
Yes.
suddenly I really want to get a graphic of myself with feet of clay. I want to see that. I want to have that. Maybe that'll become the wallpaper of my computer. Okay.
Margaret, I was sorry, I was just curious to hear about the 3 practices of compassion that you provide in the Compassion Core training.
The what of compassion?
The 3 compassion practices.
The trainings, the 3 different trainings that the Compassion Core supports. If you could
Yes,
just describe them. Yeah.
of course. Yes, so these are chosen because they're all evidence-based. Really, there's a lot of data on all of these 3 programs. And in order to get certified in these 3 programs, you have to do a lot of training. And they are the compassion cultivation training that's now out of the Compassion Institute, which I helped to develop at Stanford with Thupten Jimpa, the compassion-based cognitive training out of Emory University, and the mindful self-compassion training out of the MSc, that came from Chris Germer and Kristen Nelly. So as, someone who had very little resources, and I'm a terrible administrator with not a lot of time, I wanted to streamline the grant process as much as I could so that I wouldn't have to adjudicate on whether somebody was a good teacher, whether they were properly trained, whether the program was valid. So all of these programs are heavily vetted. And of course, with the CCT, where this started, I had personally trained, I think, the first 600 teachers. All the teachers up until this last year, I had trained and got to know a lot of them really well. And
Wow.
it was part of my love of them. That was one of many motivations in starting this grant program, and my respect for them.
That's really great. So these are highly researched, strong, typically around 8-week formal trainings, building on the notions that you've emphasized already about the value of deliberate cultivation,
Yes.
particularly at our edges and applied in different settings, and in doing a program with other people, learning from them in real ways. So these are really, really strong programs. I want to now soon start getting into the Compassion Core, this radical leveraged idea the spreading throughout the world is fantastic. But before that, we've had a couple questions come in already in the chat, and maybe I'll just start with one, and then maybe we'll see from there. From Alexandra from who asks how to talk to people about compassion in Brazil, the place I am, while people are struggling to survive. Education and understanding are poor. People did not have opportunity to develop, etc. I mean, I'm not trying to put words into Alexandria's mouth, but I think it makes me think a little bit about the critique sometimes that these trainings are for privileged people with plenty of spare time, or something that, when people are grappling with survival, that's what they need to focus on rather than compassion, let's say, perhaps. And I'm sure you have much experience speaking to those questions. Could you take a crack at it?
Sure. It's a very important question. And it is kind of a terrible idea to parachute in a contemplative program where people don't need it and they need something different. And I would really extremely discourage anyone from doing that. And by the same token, I'm in no position to answer the question about what's appropriate in Brazil because I'm not there. And I'm not on the ground understanding what's needed in the community that Alexandra is talking about. So I can't answer that question for Brazil. And the way I've worked with this in Compassion Corps is that for you, Alexandra, or anyone who wants to apply for a grant, and we'll talk about that. The application's very simple, actually. You need to be a certified teacher from an evidence-based program, and you need to demonstrate that you already have a connection with that community so that you're on the ground with them. You understand that community and their needs, and you can understand that this will be of value to them in a way that I can't begin to understand in California. And I can tell you, and I don't know if they're on the call, but if you are on the call, if it may be that Cristiano is on the call. If you're here, Cristiano, maybe you could type in a response, or if both Flavia and Cristiano are grantees in Brazil. Cristiano worked with frontline health workers in a remote village. And Flavia worked, where's Flavia worked with pregnant women in the kind of the slums on the outskirts of Sao Paulo. And, she was part of an organization doing a lot of ongoing work with that community. So she had a really deep connection and understanding of what was needed on the ground. And I'll just add this as I was reviewing the grantees this morning, and my heart was just swelling reading over these programs around the world. A lot of people are working with service workers, not with the people directly who are receiving the service. And the service workers, it's a very powerful place to intervene. For example, my dear friend Sylvia Fernandez Campos in Madrid was working with the clinical staff who were working with women who were victims of human trafficking. So, and there are a lot of examples of people. Lakiba Pittman worked with an organization in San Jose that's working with the homeless, which is a huge problem here. And a lot of these people don't have the resources and wouldn't really spend the time doing a program like this if it weren't offered for free. And the program can really help them help the people they're helping. So sometimes, the programs work. There are a lot of programs in prisons, which have been incredibly powerful. But often they're second line people. Adam Byrne did a program with families of the mentally ill, and he had been part of this national association. He has a family member who's mentally ill, and he had a direct, deep, heartfelt connection to that group. So I hope that answers the question.
Oh, very much so. And in speaking to some of the beautiful stories, we'll get into other stories as well of impact of through the Compassion Corps in really important communities.
So I've got a question from Wafula, who says, "Thank you, Margaret. Do we sometimes confuse compassion and empathy or sympathy? Are they related or not?" Good question.
Wafula, we definitely do all the time. That happens all the time. And I do think it may seem simple, but certainly in CCT, and I'm guessing in the other compassion trainings that I don't know as well, these distinctions are emphasized and they're important. So from my understanding, empathy is part of compassion. Most compassion begins with empathy, with that feeling with the suffering of ourselves or others. It's possible to have just cognitive. Actually, you can have empathy that's just cognitive in a way. You imagine how somebody's feeling without actually connecting in the heart with how they're feeling. But compassion is usually predicated on that. Compassion seems to go one step further, however, which is to connect us to the motivation to relieve the suffering. And that motivation to relieve suffering feels good. I like to say it feels good to be good. And there's a lot of data about this that Rick probably knows more about than I do, about what happens in the brain when we connect with that motivation to help, to serve. It feels good. So when that kicks in, we move beyond feeling with, which in the case of compassion is distress. Generally, it hurts because somebody's suffering, to the motivation to help, which actually is energizing and feels good in the brain. So that's a key difference. Sympathy is a word that's used differently in different contexts, but often it suggests to some people pity. We think of, in the United States, we have Hallmark cards like, "Oh, I'm sorry you're suffering, feel better soon." They're sympathy cards, they're called, and they tend to be insincere. Sympathy can be sincere, but often it goes into the territory of pity, which is a near enemy of compassion and often mistaken. So near enemies, these counterfeits for feelings like compassion, a hallmark of them is that they actually serve to separate us from the person who's suffering. Pity puts kind of a wall around us where we're here looking down saying, "Oh, I feel sympathy for you. I'm so sorry," which is different from empathy. I feel with you. I'm connected to you. So I hope that helps distinguish those three concepts a little.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Very clear distinctions there. So I like that sort of empathy being almost like the seeds of compassion, but recognizing that actually we can go a step further and bring those feelings into our heart. Yeah, really helpful. Thank you.
That was great. That was a masterclass. Thank you. From a teacher of teachers of teachers. And I just wanted to drop in a little piece of data I stumbled across recently about brain science and compassion, in that I think of compassion as bittersweet in a sense. There's the bitter of the empathy, then there's the sweet of the heartfeltness, the moral commitments, the motivation to help, and so forth. Literally in the brain, empathy alone, can basically engender affectively negative states, negative emotions of we're distressed with the other. When you add the compassion element to it, it's interesting. The sweet starts coming in with literally reward molecules in the brain that buffer people against the impact of chronic negative emotion. I'm sure there's empathy fatigue. I'm not sure there's actual compassion fatigue because of the protective power of the sweet. And that's for me, the takeaway from that, because I'm a very practical guy, was, oh, wow, the importance of emphasizing the sweet and not getting swallowed up in the empathic part alone, including when applying compassion to yourself.
I love that. And I think, some of the brain science says it actually is similar to eating chocolate, what happens in the brain. And I love chocolate. So, to think that this motivation to relieve suffering is that pleasurable in the brain interprets it the same way.
Yeah.
And I think since you bring up compassion fatigue, if I may, in the context of GCC and Compassion Course specifically, a helpful distinction that I like to make is between compassion fatigue, which may be a myth and maybe a misunderstanding if we think of compassion as indefatigable, as immeasurable, as something very akin to love, that the more we have, the more we express, the more we have, that isn't a zero-sum game. There is also compassion collapse, which is an interesting phenomenon that I'm sure you're familiar with, Rick, that Daryl Cameron's lab has studied quite a bit, where it's a kind of compassion overwhelm, where people shut down when they see a tremendous amount of suffering.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Daryl Cameron found that I think is really key for our context here is that one way to mitigate against compassion collapse is to do one small thing, to make it smaller. Because we see, what he saw in his research, I haven't read it in a while, but we see thousands of starving children in Darfur. We see one starving children in Darfur. Okay, I can do something. And we reconnect with compassion. So one of the things I love about Compassion Core is that, one teacher gets a grant, let's say $1,000, to teach a class of 20 people who are frontline workers with human trafficking or with the homeless or whatever. That, I'm going to make a pitch now. That, which I never thought I would do, that $1,000 is moving out into the world in this really huge way, and having tremendous impact. And for each of us to know that we've done something, even if it's $1, if everybody on this call gave GCC $1, that will protect you when you see suffering on the news. And we're looking at the Middle East, it's right in our face. That will protect you against compassion collapse. The smallest contribution that you can make is going to help you to keep your heart open as you face the suffering of the world. And that's a really beautiful, powerful thing.
Wow. That has enormous impact, by the way. I really thank you for that. And one nice thing about the Global Compassion Coalition is that, in a wonderful way, it's like a giant playground in a sense, because we can be creative. It's very entrepreneurial. So you say that, boom, goes in. We're gonna implement that. I think a friend of mine teases me that, Rick, you're an implementologist. the new science of implementology. It's about what your career and life and heart is so much about, is bringing it out into the world. Yeah. We've got about 20 minutes left, and I'm sure more questions will come in. maybe you could just offer a couple of compelling examples of Compassion Corps in action, right? Would that be helpful? I know there's some amazing thing that happened in, what's the name of that prison in America? It'll come to me in a
Angola.
second. Yeah, Angola, and other examples too. Just what some that really stand out for you? There's so many. And if people are previous grantees who've received Compassion Corps grants, quite a few people have already, feel free to put your own example into the chat, so forth, and say hi to Margaret, of course. Anyway, examples, Margaret?
Sure. Yeah, so let's start with Angola, which is, and I don't know if Laura Naughton is on the call. Angola is actually the Louisiana State Penitentiary, but it's known as Angola. Angola, the penitentiary is built on a plantation that was called Angola, and you can imagine pretty easily where the slaves came from. And in some ways, of course, it still is a plantation. Laura Naughton was certified as a CCT teacher and living in Louisiana. And as a survivor of a violent crime who had written a memoir about it, she was invited to give a talk at Angola and had the motivation and the insight and the courage and the vision to bring CCT into the prison that single-handedly. And it's a fortress, Angola. It's the largest maximum security prison in the country. It has a terrible reputation, although they're working hard to improve it. So Laura was motivated because she believed that compassion towards her, the person who attacked her, is what saved her life. And that gave her the creds. You know, we've been talking about this, kind of the creds to go into a community. You have to have a genuine connection. You can't just decide, oh, these people need compassion, I'm gonna bring it in here. There's got to be an already built connection. So Laura brought CCT into Angola, and it grew over the years into a prison-wide initiative. And I think many of us, I'll speak for myself, that the learning curve, when I went to Angola with Laura, we did some compassion days in the prison where we brought community members, victims of crime, lawmakers, politicians to spend a day with all the inmates talking about compassion, where they served us lunch. And Laura insisted that they get unshackled to interact with us, that they too already were compassionate. We didn't need to teach them anything about compassion. In fact, they taught us about compassion. And they were so hungry to learn the nuance and the depth and ways to express and cultivate and sustain. They were so hungry to learn it and to share it and to make Angola a more compassionate environment. They were incredibly hungry for that. So much so that the teaching assistants from the prison ended up writing a book that's called A Compassion Companion, 365 Days of Compassion for Inmates. That was kind of the culmination of that program. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Wow. Margaret, I was reading the website and just going through all the testimonials of people who did programs and attended, and there was one quote from someone, a participant at Angola, that was quite moving. So would you mind if I just read that out quickly?
Please do.
All right. I'm grateful to CCT for opening my mind to the reality that everything I require to be happy is already in my possession. That is forgiveness and compassion. I cannot say that after 57 years of not knowing peace and joy, I have suddenly arrived. However, I can say that after this CCT course, I have begun the journey, finally. May the whole world be happy. May the whole world be free from suffering. May the whole world know peace and joy. I thought that was lovely.
Thank you. You know, there were so many moving moments at Angola. That experience changed my life. And I remember the logo that they came up with, the inmates and Laura, for the whole initiative was really, how is your heart today? And they made t-shirts that said, how is your heart today? That was the leading question that they asked each other in prison. Can you imagine? In this maximum security prison, hey man, how is your heart today? Yeah.
Amazing.
Wow.
Beautiful.
And
So,
I just say there were other programs in other prisons. Sarah Scher, who is a CCT teacher and started Compassionate, an MSc teacher, did a program in a women's prison in Southern California and in a prison in Spain. There were other prison programs. Angola was one we happened to grow, and it became, it just, I think a lot because of who Laura is, it just grew exponentially at this particular prison.
Yeah. How many Compassion Corps grantees have there been so far? About?
Question. I would say about 50.
Wow. And then a typical program that might teach might have 10 or 20 people in it, perhaps?
A minimum of 20.
Wow, 1,000 plus people around the world have been served, including in the ways that you're highlighting in Angola. Wow. I know we have, limited time left. There are probably many more examples. Maybe we can get to those, but I want to make sure we get in two things here. One is, how can people apply to receive a grant to teach one of these 3 evidence-based programs?
Very important question. I hope many of you, excuse me, I hope many of you who are on the call or listening later will apply. Thanks to Maria Paula at Global Compassion Coalition, who is running the program there and is behind the scenes right now on this call, and someone I've worked closely with at CCT and also in Compassion Corps. I believe as soon as we hang up, the button or the link to apply will be live on the GCC website.
That's right.
Thanks to Maria Paula. So if you go to the GCC website, I think there's a Compassion Corps page, and it should be, oh, here we go. I see it. That's probably Maria Paula who's putting it up in the comments right now. So you click on, it's actually compassioncorps.org, because I thought that was my old website, but maybe that's all changed. I think you have to go to Compassion Coalition first, and then, because I don't want you to go to my old website of compassioncorps.org, I don't think. Because you want to apply through the Global Compassion Coalition. This is what's so exciting for me, is that I don't have to struggle with spreadsheets and getting totally mixed up about how many people do we have and who got their grant and who didn't get their grant. And yeah, so I don't think you should use my website unless there's a direct link, because I don't think the grant applications should come.
It
anywhere.
transfers. It just transfers over.
Oh, it transfers?
Yeah, people click it. Yeah, with the magic of our IT wizards working in the
Yay.
basement 24/7.
Okay, thank you for doing all that.
Yeah. And can I
So-
ask you really
Yeah.
kind of quickly, Margaret, you created this. Let's be super clear. You created it, you supported it, you poured your heart and a lot of other things into it. What has motivated you, apart from just the administrative freedom? What are your hopes for how the platform or the Global Compassion Coalition will keep supporting and growing this important work of yours?
Thank you, because that is the other thing that I wanted to talk about, Rick. So thank you for covering all the bases here. I don't know how many of you saw, or you might still be able to see, my initial website has a picture of a globe. And it's actually a video, and you see these golden threads moving around the globe.
Yeah.
And my vision, really, with Compassion Core has been both to create kind of sustainable service for all the certified teachers, because they want to give also, and to respect them, to give them money, to give free programs, to respect their wish for philanthropy,
Mm.
to help the people that they're serving who wouldn't have programs otherwise. But the bigger vision, which I really believe GCC can help with, is the idea of viral compassion. These stories inspire people to do one good thing. You hear about Laura at Angola, you watch the movie that's on the GCC landing page. Many, many people see that, and then they go out and do one good thing in the world. And this is how we grow compassion in a viral way, through stories of goodness, of philanthropy, of touching people who otherwise are untouchables, like these inmates in prison. To hear from them, your heart opens, you feel inspired. And whether it's $1 here or you're just kinder in a moment, I believe in the kind of epidemiology of a virus spreading,
Yeah.
and that it's not just COVID. We can spread compassion, and there's an engine that we can leverage to do this. And the engine is partly leveraged through seeing human goodness and feeling moved by it. I really believe that.
That's really beautiful. Speaking of philanthropy, people can be philanthropists for Compassion Corps, and anything you donate, and I assume that very quickly, Alex will put a link into or just identify a page where people can actually donate to this program, and it will be entirely passed through to the recipients, to the grantees, who will then be empowered to teach compassion more and more broadly. So we certainly invite you, whoever you are, to join with Margaret in her own supportiveness for this wonderful initiative. So it'd be great. Rachel, I have a kind of a question for you. If you, when you kind of hear the weight of this, I guess I feel this combination of weight and like butterflies. Thich Nhat Hanh was described as a combination cloud, butterfly, and bulldozer. And I think that's fairly apt for you too, Margaret. So I wonder if you could speak, Rachel, to that combination of that grounded, weightiness of it, the bulldozer aspect, and the joyful, cloud-like, butterfly-like aspects of what this initiative is. I know I'm throwing this curveball to you with no warning whatsoever.
I think what just came into my mind is just the idea of as within, so without. And I think with the heaviness of just like humans, like your own sort of personal human suffering and just the gift that compassion brings to allowing us to actually sit with that and heal our emotions and process our emotions, and also activate that sense of feel the sense of pleasure of giving ourselves that compassion. And I think the same applies with this program, that it can be quite overwhelming, just the task at hand, especially when you look at the world as it is. But here we have this gift, this tool that those who are inspired to teach and have communities to serve can activate. So, you know, we can feel the weightiness of it, but there are actions that we can take, and those actions are empowering. And, you know, I love this idea of the viral spread of compassion. Yes, please.
That's great. Yeah. Well, I think we've eaten our vegetables here, in that we've covered the bases, and maybe it's time for dessert. I mean, we've talked through also how people can apply for a grant. And if you're not yet a certified teacher of one of these 3 programs, one option would be to find a way to take one of those programs as a participant, and then go through the teacher training process. And then, maybe perhaps a year from now, apply for one of those grants. So this is something that's really developing. Our timeframes are to, open it up for applications really soon, and then process the applications, and then announce the grantees, I believe, early next year. That's my understanding of our timeframes here. So now that we've eaten our vegetables and had our carrots and broccoli, I just wonder, Margaret, if there's some final stories of grantees, the work they've done in the world, or anything in particular you'd like to share in our final minutes here. I know this has been very touching for many people, including for me. It's about the heart, right? And I just wonder if you have some things you could share with us as we finish here.
Boy, what I think one of the things I hope GCC can do with your platform and reach and leverage that I don't really feel I could do, maybe a little bit in our session today, but I couldn't do it on my own with my limited means, is to share with others how much I've been inspired by this. And I think it's going to happen with putting up videos of the stories and conversations with grantees and participants who've been through the program. I can't tell you the richness of the gold of hearing the excitement about these teachers and what it means. Burrell Poe worked with gang-involved men and women in Chicago, and Dent Gitchell, who was working it was a really politically in 2017 in the US, in Arkansas, with frontline advocacy workers and political and social activists. That was one of his programs. Ann Walter in Kentucky worked with parents who were in early recovery from addiction, who had children under 5 years old. Claudia in Chile was working with employees in the national service, working with infants who were at the highest possible risk physically and economically. And Enrique in Argentina, who worked with sanitary personnel in hospitals, offering them compassion programs. I've been the beneficiary of hearing those stories, and I want to share that, the bubbles you talked about, the joy, the movement of the heart, the opening of the heart, the goodness. I want everybody to experience that.
That's so beautiful. And, your teachings are in your face, Margaret. Thank you. Well, we're finishing up here, and thank everyone who joined us, everyone who's participated. The comments were very wonderful. Thank you, Rachel, for jumping in
Thank you. Thanks for
so
having me.
gracefully, as usual, into a moving stream. And of course, thank you deeply, Margaret, for your generosity and largeness of heart and vision. And, to quote a teaching, rippling out in ways seen and unseen, touching the great and the small, the known and unknown, unbounded, without limit. May it be so. So we will then now come to a formal conclusion. I hope that our wizards in the basement will enable our team to kind of still be able to have a little debrief afterwards. So we'll see if that works. But for those of you who've been part of this publicly, thank you and be well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.